This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen kicks off today's show discussing what a legacy is, liability of blowing dirt, what a trade or business is, and accessing landlocked parcels. Keeping the show rolling is K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre, as he explains where tar spot is in Kansas and how growers can handle this corn disease. The Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Phillip Lancaster, Bob Larson, and Jordana Zimmermann end the show conversing about checking in on cattle health while they're out on pasture. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, good to be with you again, Shelby.
Roger, today talking about things, of course, related to agricultural law and taxation, but kind of a variation of many different thoughts, as these are questions you commonly get asked, and beginning with, what's in a legacy?
Well, often when we think of legacy or legacy planning, we're thinking of estate planning, succession planning, and that is indeed true. But a legacy is more than just stuff. It's more than just the things that we own. And when it comes to farming or ranching, we often think of legacy in relation to land ownership and keeping that land ownership in the family name. And that indeed is a worthy goal and is important, obviously, to many farm families. But a legacy in general is something that you create for future generations. So it's broader than just land holdings. It's leadership roles. It's finances. It includes faith. It includes your values. It includes your reputation. It's what are you creating out of all of that for your legacy to touch future generations of your family? That's really what a legacy is.
And for people who are wanting to touch maybe those future generations with their legacy, what's your recommendation for helping those younger generations understand what the older generations wanted?
Well, that's a good question, and it ties back into a legacy, I think, being your character and what your character is. And each day is an opportunity to build a more positive legacy to influence future family generations. And that's harder for younger people to understand. And I think people mature into that. Life is brief. And values and goals change over a lifetime. And as you get older, I think you mature into a broader concept of what your legacy is. And it really is, what am I leaving for future generations beyond just the things that I own? And am I passing down that character? But again, Shelby, all of it dovetails into estate and business planning. So we do still have to think about the best structure for the farming business to make it easier for future generations to succeed. And there are various types of documents we could create to help with that type of transition plan. And what I found is that some of the most successful families that stay together and keep the farming operation together and pass down their values and their characters to subsequent generations are those that get together every year. They have a big family reunion, and at least annually. And they also include those that don't necessarily have the same passion for the farming or ranching business that the current generation has. So it's a legacy. What I try to tell people is legacy planning is just broader than estate planning, succession planning, transition planning. It's a broader concept than that, and it includes your values and your faith and really what you're committed to.
And another question you've received a fair amount, as you've included in this article, do farmers and ranchers have a liability for blowing dirt when it goes, especially across roadways?
No, and generally don't. No, you're generally not going to be held liable for injuries or death that results from obscured visibility due to blowing dirt if you're in compliance with all approved soil conservation laws and soil conservation plan for your farm. or you're otherwise using generally accepted good farming practices, you're going to be fine. And now you may get hauled into court. There may be a trial on it. But if you're farming with good farming practices, there are some things that you can't control. You can't control high winds blowing dirt in the springtime while the soil is being worked up before it gets planted, or even in the fall at harvest time when it's not so much seeded ground that's blowing dirt, but it's dust from harvest activities. It's the same principle. And no, you're generally not going to be held liable as long as you're farming in accordance with good farming practices. And on the blowing dirt issue, if you're in compliance with soil conservation laws and your soil conservation plan for your farm, you're going to be okay.
Is this just a Kansas thing, or is this similar across all states?
No, this isn't just a Kansas thing. That would be the rule that applies everywhere. And it's a rule of negligence. And again, we don't want to be doing things in improper ways that are not consistent with good farming practices. That's where we can get in trouble. But no, this is a law that's going to, or a rule, I should say, it's more common law than it is statutory all across the country.
And as we're talking through these random topics, another one included in this article involves trades and businesses. And what's the difference between a trade and business?
Well, this is a tax concept. And when IRS deems you to be in a trade or business, or when you are in a trade or business to the satisfaction of the IRS, I should say, then that means your business expenses are deductible. And that's a big deal. Now, it also means that the income from your activity is subject to self-employment tax. On the other side, if you're just engaged in a hobby activity or some activity in which you're deemed to be passive, such as cash rent of your farm ground. If you're a cash rent landlord, you're not in a trade or business activity, so you can't deduct expenses associated with that. IRS says you're in a rental activity, a passive rental activity. So that has certain connotations. Losses are not deductible. Business expenses are not deductible. But you don't have to pay self-employment tax on your income in that situation if you're not in a trade or business activity. Now, you could be deemed to be a hobby, which means you're not going to get any types of deductions whatsoever under current law. So it's a big deal. Now, the way we determine whether you're in a trade or business or not is based on all the facts and circumstances. There's no set test for determining what is a trade or business. There was a big U.S. Supreme Court case almost 40 years ago that actually involved a gambler, and he claimed that he was in the trade or business of gambling. He actually won the case based on his facts and circumstances. And what the IRS is looking for here is whether your activity is conducted on a regular and continuous basis. And again, that's based on all the facts and circumstances. So what it comes down to, bottom line, is if you're in a trade or business activity, you can deduct your business-related expenses. You pay self-employment tax. If you're not in a trade or business, no deduction of expenses. Losses would not be deductible. And you don't have to pay self-employment tax. So it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another in some situations. But most of the time, you do want to be in a trade or business so you can write off those expenses.
Was there also a more recent court case involving this?
Yeah, there was. In the tax court just about a month ago, you had the taxpayers that deducted several $1 million worth of net operating losses related to the closure or abandonment of a guest lodge project on their property. And the IRS disallowed those losses, claiming, again, hey, you're not involved in a trade or business involving the lodge. And the tax court agreed with that. And when they looked at the facts, again, it's based on all your facts, they said the lodge never functioned as a going concern. It was never capable of hosting paying guests. And so the lesson out of this is if you just simply buy a site like these people did and start construction, that's not enough to be engaged in a trade or business activity. You need to at least advertise and seek renters for the lodge in this instance. And so their hosting on their property was just occasional and isolated, and they also had income from other activities and substantial income that allowed them to run up these losses on this activity. And so without a trade or business activity, there couldn't be a deductible loss. So if you lose money on an investment before the business begins, you're not going to be able to deduct it as a trade or business loss. It's just not going to work.
And our final topic to talk about for today, accessing landlocked parcels, and how can people go about accessing those parcels, or what are some of the rules around it?
Yeah, that issue is a big issue. I get this question quite often. It's pretty common in rural settings, and sometimes ag land is landlocked with no access to a public roadway. And it can happen in several ways, but it often arises when you have a portion of a tract, say a frontage piece, that fronts a road that's sold off, resulting in a landlocked parcel on the backside. And so how do you get access to that? And basically there are two possibilities. One, the law might imply the existence of an easement based on prior use in that example that I gave you, because in that instance, then, had the two tracts been severed, they could have been subject to an easement that was required to access the adjacent parcel. Now, the other one is that the law may imply an easement based on necessity if the facts involve a conveyance of part of the land, and then after that severance, so you sell off a tract. After doing so, then it's necessary to pass over one of those tracts to get to a public road from the other tract. And so there's no pre-existing use that needs to be present in this situation. So the severance is what caused the landlocked parcel, unless that new owner is given implied access over the other parcel. And so that's where you get, without the parties settling this between themselves, between the buyer and the seller, you end up in court. The court has to determine where to place that access easement. And usually it's going to be along a fence line, along a tree row or a brush line. It's not going to be across the middle of somebody's pasture or field. But those are the issues that come up. And so these easement issues are actually pretty common, and it's best if we can agree upon these types of situations in writing and get it recorded on the land records. And that can help us avoid future disputes.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Good to be with you again, Shelby. Thank you.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read more on these topics, I will link this blog article in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about tar spot with K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre. Rodrigo, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure.
Rodrigo, beginning with, what is tar spot?
So, yes, that's a good question. So tar spot, it's not new to us anymore, right? We found it here in Kansas for the first time maybe 2-3 years ago, and I think we have learned a lot in the last years in terms of distribution management and what to do and what not to do, right? So tar spot is one of the corn diseases that we see that survives in corn residue. So folks that have had tar spot before, they're going to be dealing with this disease for a long time. Think about your gray leaf spot, right? Something that we're used to here in Kansas in managing and still producing high yielding, no matter where you are, if you have gray leaf spot. Now, I think there are a couple of things that we should talk today that are important regarding tar spot. Number one is knowing your hybrid susceptibility. Fairly important because by now we know that there are some hybrids, still high-yielding hybrids, that are fairly susceptible to tar spot. And what it means is you're going to need to pay more attention to the crop, right? Understand if you're having a susceptible and a tolerant hybrid will definitely need more attention in terms of fungicide management, timing, when and how much and what products we're going to be putting in on that crop to protect that yield, right? But tar spot, it's a fungi disease, right? And it's still here in Kansas, mainly reported on that northeast part of the state. And this week, right, or late last week, June 11th, we found it first here in Kansas as 2025, the first reports of tar spot. Now, if we think about last year, we found that in May 27, I think it's still early in the season for us to start seeing tar spot. But it doesn't really mean that we're going to have a bad year for tar spot. What it means to us is, yes, tar spot this year is active, and it's now, more than ever, time to intensify our scouting efforts. You know, early identification is crucial for your best management practice, right? You don't want to be behind that treadmill. You want to be ahead of the game. You want to know where it is, how much, and follow that disease throughout the season. It's always important, right? It's one of the diseases that can produce so much spores and be so aggressive that you really don't want to be, again, behind and playing catch. So typically we observe anywhere from V3 to V10 growth stage. So that's when we start seeing the disease in the field. But honestly, we want to make sure that the crop is protected up to that R3. So that will be your last chance to put a fungicide application. And of course, we don't want to go with a V6, V8. There are a lot of data showing that there's no benefit from those early applications, right? And by that I mean, like, it's going to be really hard for you to pay off that investment, right? So in terms of, like, talk about fungicide, right? Your best bet would be between V10 and tasseling for your first application. And if you need a second application, between that R1 and R3 in terms of timeline, right? There are a lot of products in the market that are varying from good to excellent in terms of efficacy in managing tar spot. Just keep in mind that you have a lot of things, right? What we have seen too is 2 and 3 mode of actions are typically better than 1. And 1, of course, is better than nothing, right? When you're calling that fungicide application, I think there are a lot of things to keep in mind, right? Number one, the weather conditions, what's the risk for the next few weeks, how much tar spot you're seeing in the field, what's your hybrid susceptibility. I think all those things, they have to be together, right? It's all part of your toolbox there for you to make that decision and decide if you're going to invest or not. And of course, the price of the crop too.
How can growers identify tar spot?
Typically tar spot, it's not a hard disease to identify in the field, but it can be tricky. I think there are a lot of look-alike stuff out there that looks just like a tar lesion. And when I'm scouting for tar spot, bug poop, it's the number one thing that I find. So just don't be fooled. Don't let those things fool you around. Like making sure that you're properly identifying, especially early in the season. It's hard because there's a lot of black little tar things that looks just like tar spot. For me, what really helps is, if you get a wet cloth and trying to clean that leaf, tar spot, it's not going to rub off, but everything else will clean off, will kind of like disappear, but tar spot will still remain there. The tar lesion is also embedded in that leaf, so you might see it like on both sides, right, when you're out there scouting. And of course, if you still have questions, you can always work with your local K-State extension agent. You can contact myself directly on my cell phone number, which is 785-477-0171. And also send a plant tissue to the K-State Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab.
When you're looking for tar spot on the leaves, are they usually towards the tips of them, further down the leaves, or is there any consistency to that?
Very important question. I think folks that have had it before, you're going to see starting from the bottom up into that canop, just because it survives in residue. And with the lower temperatures, higher humidity on that lower canop, that's where you're likely to find it first. Now, folks in the central part of the state and western part of the state, it can be anywhere in the canop. Because we're assuming here that, through wind movement or machine movement, the tar lesion can show up like pretty much anywhere in the canop, right? And when we think about distribution of tar spot, right, it's still mainly on that eastern part of the state, mainly on the northeast part of the state, such as Donovan, Atchison, Jefferson, Nemaha, Brown, Jackson, Coffee, Woodson, Potawatomi, Raleigh. Those are the counties that were reporting 2024. You will likely, those counties are at higher risk of tar spot just because it's being there. But I think it's important even for folks that, it's in southwest Kansas, in Johnson, or even like further south, to keep it in mind because there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of wind movement, and we just don't assume that's not going to be there when you're scouting, right? Just be ahead of the game.
For people, if they unfortunately do have tar spot in their field this year, what should they maybe think about for their next rotation of crops as they're hoping to reduce the chances of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just because the pressure is so high, we haven't seen any research showing that there's a benefit of crop rotation or tiller praxis at all. I think just because of the pressure is just so high in your neighbors in the state, the best thing that we could do for next year is starting to think about more resistant hybrids, early scouting, and a good fungicide management program for the next year. And of course, in season, right, everybody's worrying and wants to know where it is, and it's important for us to keep that in mind. We do have our tar spot map where we highlight those counties where it has been found before. And this year, for the first time, we have a partnership with Kansas Corn, and now we have a Kansas Corn disease center where growers can go and find not just tar spot, but other diseases such as southern rust, corn stunt, leaf hoppers. It's all at the Kansas Corn, KS Corn.
Rodrigo, as we're thinking about tar spot, what impact does it actually have on the crop?
Billions and billions of dollars. It's one of the diseases that we have seen over the past year reshaping the way that we grow corn. I think it's something just to think about it because, states like Iowa, Illinois, where they have been dealing with tar spot for a while, right? It's the main disease that we're fighting pretty much every year, and it has caused millions of dollars of yield loss over the years.
Rodrigo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me over.
That was K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre discussing tar spot in Kansas. If you'd like to read more about tar spot in Kansas, you can do so by checking out a recent Agronomy E-Update article from the June 12th E-Update. The article is titled Low Levels of Tar Spot Have Been Confirmed in Kansas. If you would like to keep up to date about tar spot in Kansas, following the E-Updates is a great way to do that. You can subscribe to the E-Update newsletters by going online to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. I will link these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. As Rodrigo mentioned, if you have tar spot questions, you can contact him at 785-477-0171. Again, that is 785-477-0171. Also, in today's show, he mentioned the Kansas Corn website, which is tracking corn diseases in Kansas. That website is kscorn.com/corn disease. Again, that is kscorn.com/corn disease. Of course, we'll link all these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude today's show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, and special guest Jordana Zimmermann.
Dustin, I'm going to start with you as we think about some of the implications of not identifying it early. Or we have more illness, we have more preventative health costs, we have more treatment costs. What do you see from your perspective as you think about monitoring health in pastures and how much I can spend on that?
Oh, that's a great question. You kind of caught me off guard here. Well, I guess if you aren't monitoring close, animals get sick, right? Then, there's trade-offs you got to think through is how much time do I invest monitoring those animals? Because there's cost associated with that, right? There's labor and time and maybe driving back and forth between pastures or whatnot versus, and maybe you're able to catch them illness early, those preventative costs, right? Or you don't spend the time in monitoring them and they get really sick and or die. So I guess it's hard to say. It's just that there's a trade-off though. You got to think through all the different costs associated with that along with kind of probabilities.
Well, exactly. So cost benefit if I have lower risk animals versus higher risk animals. And when I say cattle on pasture, it could mean adult cows or it could mean stocker calves that just arrived, which I'd want to spend a different amount of time monitoring those groups. Phillip, what are some of the things you think about when you think about monitoring health of animals on a pasture, what would you look at?
So one of the things that pops into my mind is you're talking about frequency here, as if you're using a more intensive grazing management system, then you're going to observe those animals more often because you're going to move them from pasture to pasture, paddock to paddock, or however your system is set up. And so you're going to observe them, maybe not every day, but much more frequently than in a continuous system where the cattle have access to the whole pasture. They may be way at the back part of the pasture when you go out there to deliver more mineral or whatever. And so you don't see them for lots of days.
Wave to them from a distance.
Yeah, So I think there's a benefit from an animal health perspective, I think, even from implementing a more intensive grazing management.
So if I can tie it to my workflow, Jordana, what's your perspective?
So one of the things I would say is that also every time depends how the management is set up. But if you can keep close to you, I would say the animals that has the higher chance to be sick for any reason, be close to your home, I would say, and then you can have a closer look or more often see those herds like heifers for ready to calve or animals that had any surgeries or weaning animals, this type of things. So this maybe could be something that could help to increase this management, how often I would look at them.
Excellent. So think about the cost benefit. Think about how I fit it into my operational flow and arrange things so it makes it convenient for me. You guys are all speaking to the things that make sense to me because it makes it easier. Scott, do you have anything to add?
No, I just maybe that your baseline expectation of issues is going to change, especially if you identify a problem, then all that goes out the window. So I think everything everybody else said is probably a good place to start.
So they're a good place to plan, but what I'm hearing you say is be prepared to change your plan, which I know, Bob, you loved modifying a good plan.
Oh, yeah. So I'm even thinking about what Jordana was talking about earlier with the rate of feed disappearance. Well, that's something you can monitor in a dry lot situation. Number of times they come to the bunk, how long they spend there. Well, in pastures, it's pretty darn different. At least in a dry lot, once or twice a day, I'm going to deliver feed, and I would expect the animals to get up and respond to that. And animals that don't, I might take special notice of. So I think you have to kind of think about that from a pasture situation, and that you may want to, if you're on horseback, actually get the cattle up, or if you ride out on a four-wheeler, get off your four-wheeler. And again, I'm looking for issues of lameness or illness such that they don't feel like getting up, and then to kind of know what cattle look like when they first get up, how they stretch. Do they immediately start to graze? Are young animals kind of showing some play behavior? And so by knowing what normal is when I go in and get cattle up, I'm really looking for animals that don't act like that.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. You can find the link to the full podcast in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.